To trade or not to trade? That is the question that now the Jets must ask themselves. We'll dive into reasons why the Jets should make a trade and why they shouldn't on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case containing 5 different antibiotics that are used to treat over 50 different types of infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com and use code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. That's JASE medical.com. Now, like I said at the top of the episode, to trade or not to trade? That is the question the Jets must answer. And Winnipeg has, for me, a couple of different compelling arguments going on. I know the Jets have been really cooking recently. And so on a video a couple of nights ago, I got a comment that said, why would the Jets make a change? It's idiotic. And I think it's actually a really good question, because when you have a team that has been as good as the Jets, what is the incentive to really change things? Why would you mess with the chemistry, alter the lines? Why make a change? Now, let's take it from the perspective of this commenter, right? Don't make a change. And I think there's actually a couple of strong arguments against the idea. The first, aside from, let's just say messing with chemistry, is that the Jets have to find a legitimate improvement, right? This team has a lot of skilled forward depth. And I think when you look at the way that the team is built, it's very much catered to Bones' style. And when you think about what sort of upgrades might be out there just aren't that many players who really move the needle. Let's take a look at Elias Lindholm, for example, right? Elias is one of the top rentals this year and would probably slide in as Winnipeg's second-line center. He has scored a lot this year, but when you actually look at how much he's contributing individually and how much he's done, in comparison to his teammates, you're finding out that, relatively speaking, he's actually not as pivotal part of the Flames offense as he used to be. I know that he had a big boost from playing with guys like Johnny G and Tkachuk, but even with those guys, there were some signs that individually, compared to his Carolina days, he was starting to slow down a bit. His individual scoring chance creation has kind of dipped. His defensive metrics have sort of dipped. He's been a decent second line center, but probably not somebody that I would feel, given the price that he's likely to command, the Jets are really that keen on. I think the other thing that the Jets are going to, have to kind of contend with is the fact that, you need somebody who can honestly add legit finishing talent, but what are you giving up, right? Is it defensive ability? Are you going to have another situation where you've got maybe somebody like Ehlers or Kyle Connor, who's those guys are very focused on offense, Scheifele too, and perhaps at times will exchange some defensive responsibility for that. Are you willing to give that up? And I think for Winnipeg at times, Bones would probably be a little bit cautious about that, especially with the younger players. I know that he tends to treat, some of the younger players with kitty gloves. I think we've seen that a lot with Perfetti at times, which, for me, I would be okay if they maybe took the gloves off. I think you can feed Perfetti and just let him do his thing. But I guess one of the principal things that you could say, the Jets don't need to make a trade, is that right now, Winnipeg is going to be getting a couple of guys back from injury in the next couple of games, right? Kupari and Heinola. And the Jets really don't have a lot of space. In fact, if you had to waive guys right now, I would guarantee you that Toninato and Janssen Fialbi would actually get claimed. I think it'd be very hard to sneak them through waivers. Stanley, you're also likely to lose on waivers. Now, whether that's a problem, you can kind of debate that yourself. But from my perspective, I definitely don't want to lose Toninato. I don't really want to lose AJF again either. Both of those guys have been really good. And quite honestly, if we're talking about a team that needs to be a meritocracy, earning your keep, can you really say that they deserve to be benched? No, I really don't think so. I love Gustafsson whenever he comes back, but for me, right, it's really hard to say that he would deserve to get in over either of those guys. Even if long term, I do think he definitely plays a larger role for this team in the future. As of right now, if things are going really well, you're struggling to insert guys, and then you have to think about, well, if we bring someone in from trade, they have to be good enough to actually get in over some of the players in our lineup. And there are some potential spots where I think there is legitimate room for improvement. But I think it'd be really hard to actually find a player, like I said earlier, that truly moves the needle and actually deserves to get in, right? There's just not that many spots. And on the defensive side of things, if you want to make a trade, obviously the Jets could potentially look for like a puck moving right sided D. But as it is right now, the Jets defensively are really sound. So the question is, do you want to focus on a team that's more defensively responsible, or do you want a team that can also add additional offense on the back end, perhaps at the expense of a little bit of defensive structure? I think that is an interesting question because, this team right now is elite defensively. They're one of the best defensive teams in the whole league, maybe the best defensive team among any squad out there, which is really saying a lot because there are some teams that are extremely stifling. At the start of the year, the Stars were stifling. The Bruins at times have been stifling. Recently, not so much for both of those squads. But like the Jets with their defense and their goaltending have been like locked down. You just really can't get past Winnipeg. They have shut opponents out, not necessarily on the score sheet, but certainly in the number of chances the Jets are conceding and the kinds of chances Winnipeg has given up. They make it very hard for you to score. And so getting ones through, it's tough. And with the Jets having guys like Schmidt and Dillon really stepping up, Pionk improving his season considerably from last year, all that fun stuff, you're like, well, is it really worth changing? And I think that is a difficult question. Now, I do have an opinion on this, and we'll talk about it later. Obviously, you can probably guess where I'm leaning, but I think that there are some pretty strong arguments to keep things the same. And I think for Winnipeg, maybe the last thing to consider is you don't want to give up assets and then not really make the most of an addition, right? You want to make sure that you're getting your money's worth. And the Jets have such a strong pool of futures that conceivably, after this 2-year window ends, the Jets are going to have another window that opens not long after that, thanks to the amazing ELCs that are about to hit this team. We're going to have perhaps a longer cup window this time. I'm really hoping than that 2017-2018 team. It's going to come down to management and coaching, kind of aligning and actually making use of the talent and skill. But based on the direction the team is going, I'm going to say I'm more hopeful than I would normally be, right? I'm thinking the team is moving in the right direction. I think that they've learned some important lessons. Let's just hope that they continue that, because that is a fantastic pool of talent in the future, very near future, mind you, to draw from. Now, I want to play devil's advocate and talk about reasons why the Jets should make a trade. And then later on, I'll give my final verdict on what I think the Jets should do as we near the trade deadline. Before we get into all of that fun stuff, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Jase Medical. I know that you and I talked to, I talk about sports. We come here to escape. Winnipeg Jets hockey has been a great distraction from the daily realities recently. But let's get serious for a minute, right? Let's talk about preparing for real life. According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right when we have a lot of different infections running around. I've actually had to deal with some nasty chest infections recently. Other folks I know have gone through it. It's rough. And I can't imagine a more frustrating feeling than not being able to go to pharmacies and get the antibiotics I need for either myself or my family when I or somebody I know gets sick, right? And especially with all of the supply chain issues that have been hitting recently, you need an answer. And Jase Medical is here to help. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics that treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, and so much more. It's stuff that could happen to any of us, and given that a lot of it's running around right now, probably already has impacted you or someone you know. To solve all of these problems and give yourself a peace of mind, go visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician's encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacist at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than right now. Go to jasemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDOFF to get $20 off your order. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about trading or not trading, right? Obviously, the trade deadline is not super close, but it's going to be here before you know it. And already we've seen a couple of deals go down. The biggest one being the Drysdale Cutter Gauthier trade, although that one happened for different reasons. But, obviously teams are still going to be jockeying. The Jets have been flirting with a lot of teams, and trade season is probably nearing more than we would expect. But before we dive into whether the Jets actually should make a trade, I just wanted to talk about something really cool that the Locked On Network is doing. We have launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with our local experts and our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Now, I argued against making a trade, and this was the perspective that I took from somebody who said we shouldn't mess with anything. So, on the flip side, right, why should the Jets make a trade? And this is a more interesting question because I feel like it actually is reasonably complicated. It requires some considerable thought to come up with a really compelling reason. But let's start off with the most obvious one. This is insurance, right? You want a player to come in who can, really change your offense and turn it from being great or excellent to almost overkill, right? At any point in your team's franchise history, there can be what we call inflection points where a decision can really put you on the path towards perhaps an eventual Stanley Cup, or it can set you back and maybe even hurt your franchise. The Jets are not really at an inflection point, I would say, where they can hurt themselves necessarily. I think Winnipeg is well stocked for the future, and generally speaking, Chevy doesn't get hosed on trades. In fact, he more often than not fleeces opposing teams, or at least gets roughly equal value, or maybe even slightly above equal, right, for the Jets' perspective. But for Winnipeg, I think you want more tactical versatility and injury insurance. You want somebody who can slide in and be that Kyle Connor replacement. Now, you're not going to find a Kyle Connor necessarily, but if you were to bring in somebody of, say, Pavel Buchnevich's talent, I know people have been talking, back and forth fantasy scenarios mostly, but talking about guys like Tomas Hertl, Claude Giroux, which I'm personally a fan of, Travis Konechny, and another of other like players that are really talented and skilled that could slide into Winnipeg's top 9 immediately and be really big impact players. Those are the kinds of guys that, yeah, they would cost a pretty considerable sum, and they do take up a reasonable cap hit. But you think about the kind of offensive talent that they bring, and suddenly you realize that the Jets could also potentially adjust their lineups. If Winnipeg could run like 2 first lines and then like maybe 2 third lines or even a second line somewhere in there, Winnipeg would have so much more tactical versatility. You could rearrange the top 6 if one like line goes a little bit cold. You have more rotational ability. All of this stuff just gives the Jets a lot of options. And I think when you have something where there's a chance to stay the course, it is tempting to kind of go with what you've got. But I think the reality is random injuries happen. You have cold spells, and you want to reduce the amount of variance, right? Hockey is an inherently random sport, and at times it can be brutally punishing even for the best teams. So you want to give yourself as many lotto tickets, so to speak, as you possibly can to punch your ticket for an eventual Stanley Cup. You never really have anything promised to you. The season beyond this, I know I've talked about a 2-year window, but next year is not guaranteed. No year is really guaranteed for any team, even teams that have won the Stanley Cup recently. So for the Jets, they have to make the most of every opportunity that they can. Last year, I felt that they didn't do it enough, and maybe it was for the best because the second half of the season was pretty dreary, and we've seen guys like Timo Meier very clearly dealing with some sort of long-term injury. He's tried to play through it, hasn't really been himself, so maybe the Jets dodged a bullet there. But I think from Winnipeg's perspective, now with the field looking even weaker than usual, this is a season where the Jets, for me, have the potential to legitimately win a Stanley Cup. I'm not even talking just as a fan bias here, but Winnipeg has legit shot at true glory, and it's going to take a lot. Now, the second reason that I think it's really important to make a deal is because, if opponents during the regular season, you see them a couple of times a year, they do have a chance to adjust, right? But maybe not that often, because maybe you play one team at one point in the year, and then the next time you see them is like 3 months later. You might not play anything like you did at the start of the year. With the playoffs, you had suddenly, consecutive nights, really, or not really consecutive nights, but a really sustained stretch of games almost every other night where you're facing the same opponent up to 7 times, which gives them a lot of chances to analyze the tape, look at your team at a deep, fundamental, grassroots level, and determine what makes you tick. I think the most clearest example I can think of how this really changed the course of a series was when Columbus swept Tampa Bay a couple of years ago. And I know it's sort of a one-off example, but I think it's a really cool, breakdown of what happened when Columbus figured out some zone exits and stuff and zone entries that the Lightning really favored. And so they targeted that aggressively because they knew talent-wise they did not stack up against this Lightning team. They didn't have the same skill, the scoring depth, and all that, but they found a way to neutralize something that was critical to Tampa's success, and they shut them down in 4 games. That stuff doesn't happen as much or as in such an extreme manner these days, but I think for the Jets, you want to have more tactical versatility, you want to give yourself options, and you want to keep your opponents guessing. Making a trade now to add additional talent that lets you have more options, a greater variety of skill to work with, and potentially, even more tactical diversity, whether it's, in transition, in offensive zone cycles, all that sort of fun stuff. You just want to have those chances to make those adjustments and keep your opponents off balance. The more that you can force your opponents to make mistakes, especially in a series where you're seeing them a lot, the better off you'll be. You want to, like I said, reduce variance. And the playoffs can be one of the most chaotic things ever because knockout tournaments are always filled with upsets. You always have lots of randomness, and that is especially true of hockey, where not only is there a lot of randomness inherent to the sport, but also because the league has a lot of parity. So Winnipeg would be wise to make sure that they give themselves all the chances that they can. Now, like I said, I am leaning towards one particular direction here, and I'll talk about what I think the Jets should do and perhaps specifically target. It's a question we've kind of gone over recently, but I think I'm starting to get more of perhaps a crystallized vision of what I think the Jets should do. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. It's almost the halfway point of the season, and of course, the Winnipeg Jets are in first place right now in the entire league, which never thought I'd say that, but here they are, President's Trophy candidates. And even though special teams maybe haven't been as good as you'd expect, Winnipeg is still on top. But regardless of where we are in the standings, though, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing Daily Fantasy Hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your bet in daily fantasy hockey contests. For those of you who are super big stats nerds and love following all of the top players, whether it's McKinnon, Crosby, McDavid, Ehlers, Hellebuck, Vasilevsky, you name it, they've got stats for them. Even defenders like Fox and Makar and Morrissey, they've got that too. Well, they track stuff like goals, assists, save percentage, all that fun stuff. And if each day you beat Sleeper's projections, whether it's more or less, you could win cash. And if you do it with 8 correct stats categories selected, you could win 100 times your bet. That is 100 times your bet playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention so you can nail your picks and win big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions do apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about Winnipeg's trade stuff. And obviously, I've given 2 different arguments for reasons why the Jets need to make a trade or don't need to make a trade. And like I said, you can probably guess which side I lean on. I think the Jets should absolutely be exploring the trade market and, willing to shake things up if need be. Not because this team is bad, not even remotely close to that. It's because you can make this team so overkill that it's, really Winnipeg's Stanley Cup to lose. Now, that's not really how the world works when it comes to the playoffs. Like I said, randomness, chaos, all of that can really derail things quickly. But you can't get to the dance and have a good time if you don't punch your ticket. And, the Jets have the resources to actually make a really big play this year and still be fine for the long term. thanks to some really savvy drafting and some great prospects, the Jets are looking pretty set for the long term and near term. But let's get even better. And I think what I want the Jets to target, I would say at this point, go for a second line center. Nemesnikov has been sick in this role, but I think what you could get, from maybe a team like Buffalo or something, Casey Middlestat would really be an interesting fit. I'd prefer to avoid Lindholm from the Flames. I just feel like he's maybe a little overhyped right now, relatively speaking. But if that isn't really the best option for me, I would even be really interested in looking at Travis Konechny from the Flyers. In fact, Konechny has kind of over the past couple of years climbed up my trade interest standings. I feel like this might be the highest I've really been on him. He's had a monster season for the Flyers. He's been amazing, and he's really versatile. I think he's primarily played wing recently, but if you're not getting like a second line center, like an elite finisher like him would be awesome. And because he has like legit positional flexibility, although he will prefer to play out wide, you can do whatever you want with him. That gives the Jets lots of options. It also allows them to kind of play around with the lineup and maybe even keep Nemesnikov on the second line. I mean, there's just all of this flexibility and decision-making that you can have thanks to the added depth and skill that you're bringing in makes the Jets even deeper. Now, what would be kind of fun is, considering, right, if you have, say, Connor come back, you've got maybe Connor Perfetti and, I don't know, maybe Konechny, right? Maybe you imagine that scenario, first line, Scheifele, Ehlers, Velarde. Jeez, I mean, what do you even do with that top six? I mean, that is just absolute spitting venom. One of the best forward groups the Jets would ever have. Even without bringing in Konechny right now, you'd still have like a crazy amount of skill to work with. Now, I don't know if Perfetti would necessarily play down the middle on that line. Maybe you'd have Konechny there instead. At that point, I don't even care. You just arrange it somehow that's going to have that elite talent to work with. And I think the rest will just naturally take over. It would also allow you to run like Niederreiter, Lowry, and Nemesnikov together. And based on how that, Nemesnikov has been recently and the third line maybe starting to find a rhythm again, I think it could be awesome. And people will say, okay, well, then what happens with Appleton? Listen, you have a fourth line of Barron, Appleton, and maybe Kupari or Toninato or Iafallo. That is like a cup contender fourth line, right? It'll have defensive responsibility. It'll have scoring upside. You name it, the Jets are going to have it. And they'll have so many different ways to attack opponents, whether it's at even strength or on the power play, that I think you can just overwhelm your opponents. That's how the 17-18 team really rolled. 4 different great lines capable of doing all sorts of different tasks. Whatever role that you asked them to play, they could do it. If you wanted them to finish chances, they could do it. If you wanted defensive responsibility and two-way play, they could do it. That's the kind of stuff that I think a trade would really do for this team. And like if somebody, goes down for another 4 to 6 weeks, don't even worry about it. You're not even skipping a beat. You still have the depth to get through it. And already we've seen how the Jets have coped with the loss of Velarde and KFC. They've done marvelously. Can they consider consistently do it, over the next few months? If they lose somebody else, well, you don't want to leave that up to chance. Make sure that you can, again, stamp as many lotto tickets as you can. The more chances you give yourself and the more breathing room that you have, the better and more likely it is that you go on a deep playoff run. And I really feel like with Hellebuyck playing perhaps the best hockey of his career, this team defensively playing the best and most responsible hockey of its tenure in Winnipeg, this is a time where the Jets really should cash in the chips and give themselves every opportunity. Because if a cup comes to Winnipeg, it would be, I guess, I don't even know how to describe it, life-changing. I know franchise-altering is like the common phrase, but I feel like it's something even bigger than that, not just for the team, but for the city. Fans would probably flock to games every night the following few seasons. They'd eat this team up. And the Jets, with how much swagger and confidence they have, can you really feel like they're in line to be stopped by anyone? I'm not seeing a team that can touch them right now. They've been that good. I know that they're beating up on weaker teams right now, but they've beaten up on the strong teams too. Winnipeg is peaking, and I feel like it's not a sort of peaking where they're going to run out of steam. I think this team is going to weather stuff just fine. I think they've proven that they're extremely resilient, they're tight-knit, and they play incredible hockey. So, for me, trading for a player and bringing somebody who's got even more scoring talent in is really a reward for just how hard this team has worked and how good they've been. Give the boys an extra treat, give them a teammate who can help them get even closer to a cup, and I think this team is absolutely going to sizzle when it comes to the playoffs. But let me know what you think. What is your verdict? Give me your thoughts on whether you're for or against a trade. Maybe you've changed your mind, or maybe you're still on the fence. Give me your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at @JLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day, every day. Tomorrow, we will have some thoughts on how the Jets do against the Chicago Blackhawks. And then on Monday, either Monday or Tuesday, I might take Monday off since it is MLK Day. But on Tuesday, I'll probably have some recap action for you after the Flyers game. But like I said, that is all the time that we have for tonight. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. We will see you back here tomorrow night for post-game coverage, so don't go anywhere. Be sure to subscribe, and as always, have a great night, and go Jets go.